So 2 weeks ago, thank you, we did the 12 spies, and then last week you guys did canvassing the neighborhood, but Paul taught on Joshua. So we're just going to keep in line, so we're not skipping over it, but if you want to catch that, go watch Paul's video. And we're going to jump ahead to Gideon. And have to be honest, when I looked at it, I was like, man, there's not a lot to Gideon. But the more I dug into it, like, there's a lot. There's a rabbit hole of things you can really get into. So I'm going to try to keep it short because I want to spend some time in prayer, um, in, but at the end here. But anyways, so all of this comes out of Judges 6 and 7, and starts with Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land. And the 12 tribes overcame most of their enemies, but the land wasn't completely taken by Israel. Pockets of Canaanites remained, and they or nearby nations often rose up in power and dominated Israel. In fact, the book of Judges describes a repeated cycle in which Israel disobeyed God, usually through idolatry, was subdued by an enemy, cried out for deliverance, and was freed by God-appointed deliverer. Lather, rinse, repeat. They lived in peace, disobeyed, and the cycle began over and over again. All over again. So for 300 years, this cycle continued. Israel lived in frequent rebellion and needed frequent deliverers or judges to free them and turn them back to God. It's one of those things that you kind of know, but you forget. Like 300 years after Joshua came, they conquered the land for 300 years. This constant cycle of following God, falling away from God, being oppressed, being delivered, living in peace, and then again for 300 years. And that's not even to the kings yet, to all the wicked kings and all of that. Like, we're still no king yet. So Joshua told Joshua to be strong and courageous. Today we're going to hear about a leader of Israel who wasn't very strong or courageous, at least when the story begins. But would his fears and insecurity limit God to ours? Let's listen to how God called and strengthened Gideon and used him to do great things in spite of his weaknesses. And think about how God might use you to do great things too. So, the story goes like this. The Israelites did bad things in God's eyes, so he let the Midianites rule over them. The Midianites and other eastern peoples were so oppressive that the Israelites had to hide in mountains or caves. You don't have this in your packet, Adam. Whenever Israel planted crops, the oppressors would ruin them and ravage the land. So Israel cried out to God for help. So did some research, did some additional digging in this and some commentaries. And essentially, the Midianites were nomadic desert dwellers that primarily used camels as transport. And so they wouldn't occupy the land all year round. They'd only come in when it was harvest time. And so they would come in, ruin all the crops and everything, and they'd go all the way from the east to the west, ruin everything, and then head back out. So they would just come in, they would pillage, they'd take donkeys and sheep, and they would vanish. And so basically theirs was an economic oppression and essentially completely impoverished the nation. We see the Israelites living in caves and all that. They're living in fear and humiliation instead of living out in houses and in security. God sent a prophet, and we don't know his name, to remind the Israelites how he had saved them from Egypt and to explain why they were being oppressed. Then an angel of God came to Gideon as he was secretly threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. And this is also interesting because when you thresh wheat, you usually want it on kind of an elevated area where the wind can blow the chaff away as you're breaking out the wheat. So a wine press is usually two pits dug into the ground. One is kind of flat and angled where they stomp the grapes, and it runs through a trough into a bigger pit where the wine's collected. And it's usually carved out of rock or stone in the ground, and usually fairly deep, so you could see how he would get down in it and he'd be threshing wheat, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to see him. But at the same time, as you're threshing wheat in a vat, It would be very difficult to get the chaff out from the wheat. It would be a very tedious process. All right. The angel said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon asked why the people had been abandoned by God, why the miracles of old didn't happen anymore. The angels told him to use what strength he had to deliver Israel. Gideon asked how he could do that. After all, he was from the weakest clan and was the weakest in his family. "I will be with you," the angel said, "and you will strike down all the Midianites together." Use what strength he had to deliver Israel. Now, one of the commentaries I read said that the army of Midianites was about 135,000 Midianites that filled the valley of Jezreel. And for a little added touch, because I'm full service that way, I gave you guys some maps that kind of laid out where the valley of Jezreel is. You can also see on the back here where you see Gideon's battle, and you see some of the same landmarks and to where he chased him. And then at the bottom is a picture from Megiddo, looking out over the valley of Jezreel, and you can see Lower Galilee. So this is kind of facing east-northeast. And you can see Lower Galilee, and you can see Mount Tabor, Mount Hilamora, and Mount Gilboa. Does anybody know what the significance of Mount Gilboa is? We haven't got there yet in this study, but just any Bible nerds? Where King Saul was killed. So that is the mountain that David cursed. May you have no dew or rain and crops. Mount Gilboa. I can't remember the significance of Mount Tabor, but anyways, you get a sense. I mean, the Jezreel Valley is truly called the breadbasket of Israel. It's just this huge valley that stretches all the way from the Jordan all the way up to Mount Carmel, which is right on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. So you have this huge area that is just flat and lush and grows so much. So you can see why in this story the Midianites are going to gather here, and really where you see the orange circle here, they'd gathered at basically the entrance to the valley. So they were staging to go in and huh? Okay. Sisera. Okay. So this was the previous judge that delivered him there. That's it. So they think that's one of the sites of Transfiguration. Another one says it's possibly up closer to Caesarea Philippi. But anyways, so just a couple interesting tidbits, and just kind of give you a visual, because I'm a visual guy, to get a picture in your mind of what things looked like, what the situation was. And so you have right where that circle is, that is where, you know, right where Gideon lived, and it was right there at that entrance to the valley of Jezreel. Okay, continuing on. Gideon wanted to know if this was really God speaking to him, so he asked if he could go get an offering and bring it back. Told yes, Gideon brought an offering of meat and bread. The Lord touched it with his staff, and fire flared up. Gideon realized it was the Lord, so he built an altar and named the place, "The Lord is Peace." So this is an interesting study, and I could go down this rabbit hole. We could be here all night. But the angel of the Lord is a really interesting Bible study if you want to dig into it, because there is a few different theories of who the angel of the Lord is that you see throughout the Old Testament. You see this figure identified as the angel of the Lord coming in, but doing things that if you pay attention, only God can do. So in one part of the Exodus, he does a creation act, or he does a creation act, and he also, later in Exodus, he offers forgiveness. Two things only God can do. And so a large body of commentators seem to think that might have been Jesus' pre-incarnation making appearances on earth and doing work. Because later on, in the Gospels, you hear Jesus saying, "No one has seen the Father except the Son." So if Jesus is saying that, no one has seen the Father except the Son, and he told Moses, no man can see me and live. That's why he had to cover him, and Moses can only see his backside. And then we also know this. Jesus described the Spirit as wind and spirit. Kind of process of elimination is probably Jesus that came. So interesting study if you ever want to go down that path and see all the places where the angel of the Lord shows up through Old Testament. It's really interesting to see that theme go through it. That same night, God told Gideon to tear down his father's altar to Baal and build a true altar to the Lord in its place. He was to sacrifice a bull on it. Gideon took 10 servants and did as the Lord said, but he did it at night because he was afraid of his father and the men of the town. When the men woke up the next morning and discovered what had happened, they had found out Gideon was responsible. They went to Gideon's father and demanded that Gideon be put to death. But his father refused and told them that if Baal was a real god, he could contend for himself. So the people started calling Gideon Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend. So he has this experience. He meets the angel of the Lord. Angel of the Lord burns up the offering. Up to that point, the angel of the Lord said, you're going to use what strength you have, and I will be with you to drive out the Midianites. But then, right after that, we see where God speaks to Gideon again and says, but first, you need to tear down the altar of Baal. And actually, the pole beside it, which was likely an Asherah pole. And so tear those things down and build up an altar. And the commentator I read, mentioned that in Gideon's community, likely they worshiped Yahweh and Baal all at the same time. And so essentially what God was doing was saying, before you can do this, we got to clean up your own house. And so I think that's an interesting thing for us to kind of dwell on, because sometimes we want to do something for God, but sometimes he will say, well, you need to take care of some stuff in your camp first before you can go do something for me. And we see that here, that pattern here with Gideon. Soon afterwards, the Midianites crossed the Jordan to raid Israel. God's Spirit came upon Gideon, and Gideon blew a trumpet as a call to arms. Gideon still wanted to know if God was really going to save Israel through him, so he asked for a sign. He put a fleece on the ground and told God that if dew was on the fleece and not on the ground around it, he would know that God was with him. When Gideon got up the next morning, that's what he found. The ground was dry, but the fleece was wet enough for him to squeeze a bowl full of water out of it. Then, to make sure, he asked for the opposite sign, dry fleece and wet ground. The next morning, that's exactly what had happened. And this is also interesting because it also says, don't put the Lord your God to the test. This is a sign of God's mercy to Gideon and to us, that one, not only did he honor his request to with the fleece one time, because even in that request he said, if you do this one thing, I'll know. And so he did it, and then Gideon says, well, wait, can you do it again, but the other way around, so then I can know? So God was merciful twice with Gideon. One, for honoring the request in the first place, and then two, when he said, well, I know I said that, but can you please just do it again? So also just an interesting look at the character of God. Gideon went out with his men to attack Midian. As they camped near the Midianites, God told Gideon he had too many people with him. The Israelites might think they won with their own strength if they defeated Midian with so many people. So God told Gideon to tell everyone who was afraid to leave. So at this point, he'd wrestled up about 32,000 men. And so God told Gideon to tell everyone who was afraid to leave. How many people do you think Gideon thought would leave when he said, if you're afraid or fearful, go ahead and leave? How many men do you think Gideon thought he was going to lose? Probably just a few hundred, right? How many did he actually lose? 22,000. He lost 2/3. So 2/3 of the men were fearful and they left. So that left him 10,000. Now, mind you, we still have 135,000 over here. So 32,000 was still 5-1 odds, close to 5-1, 4-1 odds, right? But still, but God said, no, I don't, right now, if you attacked him, you could potentially say you did this in your own strength. So Send away anybody who's afraid. So that left 10,000. But the Lord said that that was still too many, so he told Gideon to take all of the men down to the water and separate those who got down on their knees to drink from those who lifted to their mouth with their hands and lapped it up with their tongues. Only 300 lifted the water with their hands, so God told Gideon to keep those and send the rest home. Gideon took this position with only 300 men, so 32,000 down to 300. Now, what's interesting about this little test is that, you have this spring in this cave, and some of the men just did what you and I would do, where we'd scoop it up and we'd do this, right? Most of them got down and lapped it like we would see a dog do it, right? They stuck their face down in the water. And that's an interesting test, not only when you're testing warriors, because a warrior would probably bring their hand to the face so they could be aware of what's going on around them at all times. They wouldn't stick their face down in the water. So, what's that? So, that night, God told Gideon to go down to the Midianite camp, and if he was afraid, to take his armor bearer with him. God promised Gideon that he would be encouraged by what he had heard. So Gideon went down to the camping of the Midianites and their many allies at night. Gideon and his armor bearer arrived just in time to hear one Midianite telling another about his dream. So Gideon was afraid because he took his armor bearer down. He's going down, and in the dream, a loaf of barley rolled down into the valley and overturned a Midianite tent. They realized that this was a sign that the Midianites had been given into Israel's hands. Gideon was encouraged and thanked God. He went back to his camp and told his 300 men to get up because God was going to give them the victory. Another thing I learned in studying for this, a barley loaf. Barley was what poor people and animals ate. Most bread was made out of wheat. Barley was considered a lesser grain. And so it is an interesting picture where you have this barley loaf, this poor person's loaf, roll and destroy the Midianites. So Gideon was encouraged. Gideon divided his men into 3 groups and gave each man a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch inside. The 3 groups gathered around the edges of the Midianite camp, and when Gideon gave the signal, they all blew their trumpets, smashed their jars, held their torches up, and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." What don't you hear that's in their hands? A sword. Which is really interesting. So 300 men sitting around 135,000. Gideon tells them, all you have in your hands is a trumpet and a jar with a torch. I'd be like, question. How are we going to drive them out with just a trumpet and a torch? But that was also a sign where, we see that the Midianites thought they were surrounded. They began to run and began fighting against each other with their swords. So they started going at each other, which I've always wondered how that could happen, and I haven't really had a chance to study it, but like how somebody could stand up and say, "I'm freaked out, and I'm going to kill you now, even though you're on my side." But anyways, they started killing each other, and then they fled. And the many other men from Israel pursued them and cut them off from escaping. They captured and killed the 2 Midianite leaders and won a great victory over their oppressors. So 2 chapters summed up pretty quickly. But you see here in the map where they chased them down. At one point, Ephraim and some other tribes get involved. So God wanted the 300 to start, but later on we see more of Israel get involved in the destruction of the Midianites and the capture of the 2 kings. All right, questions. So why did the Israelites cry out to God for help? And according to God, why were they in the situation that they were in? And we're going to try to use mics for our friends out on Facebook. Hello, Facebook. Anybody? This is so much better if you interact.
The Israelites cried out for help because they done messed up again.
Help, help, I'm being repressed.
Isn't that, though, do you think they when they were crying out to God, they realized why they were being oppressed. So basically, they're crying out to God and saying, He's being mean to me. Take care of it. Isn't that so much like human nature to the point it's somebody else's fault? The Midianites are oppressing us. The Midianites are the reason we're in this. And what did God respond? No, he said, no, that's not why you're in this. You did this to yourself. Do you think God rescues us when we're responsible for our own messes? Why do you think he does? He's merciful. It's absolutely merciful. Where was Gideon when God spoke to him, and why was he there? In the wine press. Come on, Jordan, you got to be faster, man.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, he's threshing wheat in the wine press. Why was he there?
He was scared. He
He's
didn't want
scared.
anybody to see him.
Nobody
He
could
wants
see him
somebody to
there.
come and mess up all his wheat.
Yeah. That had to be tedious, too. How did God address Gideon? Now, how did God address Gideon?
He sent the angel of the Lord. Oh, you mean
Yes. Yeah. Like I address you as Kimberly.
man of valor,
Man of honor.
woman of valor?
Did that seem like an accurate description?
No, he was scared hiding under an oak tree.
Right? So God sometimes calls us as what he knows we are, not what we think we are. What questions did Gideon ask God? Huh? Too many questions.
Do you want me to read from the scripture?
Sure.
And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then has this all befallen us?
I like the dramatization.
And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. I can keep going if you want.
You're busting out the King James tonight. I'm gonna get you an ESV here in a second. So in the same breath, right, we see Gideon basically saying, "The Lord has forsaken us. The Lord has delivered us into the hands of all that." Still, kind of casting blame on that point, and reminding often says, and we see God say in Scripture, "I'm the Lord that brought you out of Egypt." Where are the miracles? Where have you been? What did Gideon think about his ability to fulfill the mission that God gave him?
He probably felt really unqualified.
Well, he said, "I am from one of the least tribes, and I'm the least of my family." Does God always go for the biggest and the best? No, not at all. Mhm. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. But that one comes later, too. What was Gideon's first? Oh, sorry. Rewind. What did Gideon do to make sure he had been talking to God? So at this point, he's talking to this guy. He called him mighty warrior and told him he was going to deliver Israel from the Midianites. could have been just a guy who was a little sauced, for all Gideon knew, right? I mean, he probably, at that point, guy claiming to be speaking on behalf of the Lord. I'm just saying, and if they were being ravaged by the Midianites, it probably wasn't very good wine. So what did he do to make sure he was talking to God? Adam, look at you.
He asked if he can bring a offering,
Mm-hmm.
and God set it ablaze, and he asked to build an altar.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting, right? Because again, if you think it's some guy, that's a unique kind of test, isn't it? I'm not sure if you're the Lord, but I want to bring you an offering. It just seemed a little interesting to me. And then God lit it on fire. After that, what was Gideon's first big assignment? How do you think he felt about it, and what was the result?
Destroy the altar of Baal.
Thank you, Corey. Destroy the altar of Baal.
Nobody's raising their hand. They're just saying stuff. I don't have time.
You destroy the altar of Baal. How do you think he felt about that, though? Oh, Linus jumping in.
So what was interesting is it's not just an altar, it was his family's altar, which means he had himself more than likely worshipped at that altar before. And so he was tearing down his family's altars, which, I mean, imagine going up against all the patriarchs of your family.
As the least in your family. And you got 10 servants to do it. Like, you had to know the servants were like, are you sure? Because likely the servants also worshipped Baal. Why did Gideon ask for a sign when it was time to go out and fight against Midian?
Maybe because he just wanted to be extra sure. And like, he was just
Extra sure.
probably a little nervous. Like, I think if I was told, hey, you're going to go up against an army of people that have oppressed you for years, I'd probably be thinking, are you sure it's me? Like, you sure? I don't know. I think I'd be a little intimidated.
Yeah, and I've been chewing on this one because it's kind of that same vein of like when we were talking about the Israelites in the wilderness in the Exodus. Like, they saw sign after sign. So literally, God touched his staff to the offering and it was consumed in fire. Why wasn't that enough? Like, he's asking God essentially to prove himself again, right? And I guess it would be easy to judge since I've never been in that situation, but it still just kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit like, God literally lit the offering on fire. And now you're going to, and we also don't see how much time passed between him tearing that down and then going to fight them.
Wanted to be sure, God was leading the army, Gideon's army. Gideon wanted to be sure that God gave him the proper timing to attack.
That's right.
Well, I think he could have trusted God, but I don't know, this particular one, I mean, tearing down my idols, yeah, that makes sense. God would tell me to do that, but does he really want me to go commit suicide with our entire army? Is that his plan for my life?
I'm going to take all the fighting men of Israel. We're going to go just get slaughtered. Yeah. Doesn't speak a lot for how sure that Gideon was for God's promise. Why do you think God told Gideon he had too many men to go fight against Midian?
I think it's the same reason he chose Gideon to lead the army. Gideon was from the least impressive tribe and the least impressive member of his family, and God chose him to show that it was God, not Gideon. And so the same thing happened with the army. If the army was too big, then maybe you could think, well, maybe they just got really lucky, and that's why they beat the Midianites. But God is shown to be bigger when he uses the weak to do something strong.
Mm-hmm. Plus, if the 22,000 were weak and afraid, how committed do you think they were to what was going on? Right? Taking leadership from Gideon, who by that point probably the word had spread about him tearing down his father's altars and doing all of this, right? So, just a little human reason and all that, but yes, so that God could show himself strong and mighty, but at the same time, a secondfold purpose is those 22,000 men, if they were fearful and afraid, how likely were they to follow a guy, who tore down the altars of what they'd been worshiping as well to go against the Midianites because he claimed to hear from God. They didn't see the fire of the altar. They didn't see the fleece. They just heard a trumpet and they showed up. So, I like some of the questions. I don't like some of them, so I kind of skip over them. How did God encourage Gideon before the battle? Mr. Lonnie.
He showed them that the enemy was at this point afraid of Israel because they had a dream that showed that they were going to lose to the Israelite armies, and so that gave him more courage even now because he knows. He not only knows what he knows that they are questioning a victory as well.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think he needed to do that, though?
Gideon still had self-doubt even after all the previous actions of the Lord.
But he called him mighty warrior. Oh, I understand. But you kind of see the irony in that, right? Mighty warrior. Okay, now I'm going to burn up this offering. Now I'm going to do 2 fleeces. And now I'm going to let you overhear a Midianite talking about the dream he had. Like, reassurance after reassurance after reassurance after reassurance to the mighty warrior. It's an interesting thing to think about. What strategy did Gideon use to defeat the Midianites? The trumpet. So basically, 300 men around 135,000. Got the pitches, make a lot of noise, and
So prior to my phone dying, I looked up why they would have kind of turned on each other, just because I was curious about the answer to that. And it said that kind of they were already afraid of the sword. So when the men had heard that they were bringing the sword, and they had turned on one another to prevent from getting captured, because they were afraid of the sword to be used while they were captured. So they suspect that it was kind of a turn on one another so you can't get captured.
Interesting.
I just thought of it as like pickup games of basketball where it's like, oh, that guy's open and you pass him the ball, but that was actually the other team and he just got 3 points on you because you weren't paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
Or there's so many people in the Midianite army, and it talked about them being like from the Midianites and their allies this wasn't necessarily a unified force that had known each other for years and years and years. They were raiding parties.
This is
they,
true.
they stormed across the land, pillaging and taking, and I think they counted on fear from the people they were pillaging more than a unified, organized army.
Well, and that would also speak to if they're nomadic, right? They're not like they're all wearing uniforms.
I also, whenever I think of the story of Gideon, I think of the VeggieTales one where they're all like in a valley and the veggies are standing on top, and the acoustics there had to be intense.
Yeah.
So it probably sounded way more than 300 trumpets.
Mm-hmm. Echo. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think too, God may have caused the Midianites to be confused.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
That's no doubt. You still think about that, right? Like, what was it like in that moment? That all of that. I mean, it's kind of that perfect storm, right? They probably all weren't. They probably all didn't know each other. They probably all weren't wearing anything identifying them as the Midianite army versus the Israelites, right? So, very interesting. How do you think God feels about our insecurities and fears, and in what ways does He encourage us today?
It says in the scriptures, in the Bible, it says, do not be afraid in some form 365 times.
Mm-hmm.
There's 365 days in the year.
Mm-hmm.
That's on purpose. He's reminding us every day, do not be afraid, because he's with us.
I think also, you know, the messenger of the Lord told Gideon he was a mighty warrior, and it definitely seemed like Gideon didn't believe that. And I think when we read the story and what happened, maybe we don't believe that. But I don't think God was gaslighting him. God believed, Gideon, you are a mighty warrior.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about you that I know that you don't know. I think the same thing's true for us today. Even when we fail, even when we mess up, even when we don't think we can do it, there's something about us God knows that we don't, and He
Yep.
calls us to His plan for our lives.
It's very valid.
I also think He uses our insecurities and fears to make us stronger and better people. Because when we conquer those things, we can help others conquer that too. Because He uses our weaknesses to make us strong.
Yeah, He's usually going to call you something that involves a weakness, right? It's not going to call you, not necessarily going to call you something that is easy for you. And so,
I wonder if Gideon was actually the least of his tribe.
what do you mean?
Like, yeah, he just thought he was. Not so. I kind of get picture of imposter syndrome
Mm-hmm.
from Gideon. Like, he thinks he's less than he is, and not that he's like hiding his true self. He just doesn't realize the man he could be or the man he is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky to look at it because, yeah, that could be it. Could it just be a poor self-image? Or, culturally then too, like, sometimes it's easy to fall into looking at it through American eyes, right? And how we understand culture and how we understand position and relationship and leadership. When back then, it was very much differently ingrained. Like, you had a position or a stature in the culture and in society, and you were pretty much stuck there. The firstborn's always got a double portion. Those all those different kind of cultural things. It was a culture of honor or shame. Like, if if you did something shameful, it stuck with you, and that became your identity. And you see that in some of the stories of the Bible where, like Naomi, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because I'm bitter, right? I have shame now. I have bitterness, and so you don't really know. Could it have been a positional? Could it have been insecurity? But it does point to, again, God using, things that we think are weak or that don't make sense to exercise his plans, to give him glory. Do you think God gives us assignments that are beyond our ability to carry out in our own strength? All the time. That's an easy one. But this is the one that I want to spend a little bit of time in prayer on. Has he given you one? And how are you responding to that? And maybe he said something to you a while back and you've kind of ignored it. But I want to, Lonnie, if you wouldn't mind putting on a little bit of music, let's spend just a few minutes in prayer. We've got about 5 minutes. Just kind of praying through, is there something that maybe God has called us to or called out in us, or even something he wants us to clean up in our own house because of something he's called us to do? And just spend a little time in prayer for that.